Welcome to Digging for Truth. My name is Henry Smith. I'm your co-host for the program, sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research and WBPH. One of the passions of the ABR ministry is to encourage the church to educate children in the gospel and the belief in the scriptures are reliable. Archaeology serves the church and the work that we do in order to encourage Christian education. Although our ministry is not designed to minister to children per se, we encourage and provide information to Christian educators and parents to help them to be able to equip their children to defend the faith. We believe this is extremely important. And along those lines, my guest today is Dr. Mark Stanton from Salem Christian School. Mark, it's great to have you here in the studio.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here and for coming in to talk to us about training kids in the Christian worldview.
Yeah, excited about it.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you here. So, as I was saying in the intro, one of the passions of our ministry is to provide parents and educators with information that they can trust the Bible. And you are deeply involved in doing exactly that, training kids, children, and young people in the Christian worldview. If you would share with the audience a little bit to start with about yourself and about what you do to do that.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a Christian home outside of Detroit, so in fact, several generations believers, so it's always been part of my life and culture, but of course I had to make it my own. I went to Christian college, got a business degree. After a few years, my wife and I decided that was not my calling and that I should go to school, so I got my bachelor's degree and taught elementary school at public school and some rural, urban, as well as a private, and then Christian schools as well. And so along the way, I got a master's and worked as a principal, then a superintendent of a private school district, and then I got my doctorate, and then last year, in March of 2017, I finished my doctorate program and successfully defended my dissertation on Worldview, actually.
That's excellent.
Yeah, the Worldview of Inclusivity in Christian School at Rutgers University, and this is my looking at integrating that into everything that I do. And that's a little bit about me, but as far as our school, as my head of school, I'm at Salem Christian School, which is in Macungie, right at the top of the hill above Macungie in Upper Milford Township. We hover around 200 students, give or take, each year. Pretty
Excellent.
Stable enrollment. It's a K-12 school as well as a preschool, and it is my passion. I wanted to be in a Christian school for this very reason, because we need to be educating our students and inoculating them from the secular nonsense that they're bombarded with.
Yeah, thank you for all that. It's good to hear. When we have guests on the program, we want to hear your story, your background. It's interesting you went to Rutgers, by the way. There's a connection with the two of us. I got my economics degree from Rutgers.
Oh, wow.
But actually, I didn't know the Lord then. And so I majored in a lot of foolishness, and God called me out of that life, and I got saved in my late 20s. But you spent time at Rutgers being much more productive than I in getting your doctorate. Tell us a little bit about that, about how that worldview studies that you've done applies to Salem Christian School and how you use that. You could tell the audience about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're looking at education, you're really talking about helping students learn content skills. And then you're doing that in a secular or a Christian environment. However, in a Christian environment, we understand that the content and skills are hollow and not quite complete unless they have a biblical integration in there and some sort of Christian worldview integration, because in my worldview, and how I've doubled down on my life, is that I believe that without that, you have some hollowness because you're forgetting what created it all. And so in that, I went to the university to figure out how to do that best as a leader of a school. And interesting enough, I learned how to do that better at a Public university,
Yes.
I had to defend it quite often in both grace and truth. And so I'm teaching my students how to do that, teaching my teachers how to do that, and making sure that whatever subject that we do has some sort of Christian worldview integrated into it.
Yeah, that's excellent. So you were kind of in the frying pan, as it were, or in the fire, you might say, or both.
Yes.
But it caused you to, it forced you to be sharper in articulating and being able to use the Christian background in terms of education.
Absolutely.
For kids. Now let's move to that. The idea of inculcating or teaching children the Christian worldview. You know, some people out there would say, you know, we should let kids decide what worldview they're going to have. Or, well, I'm not going to indoctrinate my kids in a particular worldview. Now, as the church and as a Christian, what are your some thoughts about that? How would we respond to that as the church, and why do we want to inculcate our kids with a Christian worldview?
I would say the number one thing that we're supposed to do, and it's out of Jesus' lips himself, is that we're to love God with all our mind, body, and soul.
Yes.
And that in order to do that, we have to make sure that we are consistently renewing our mind, and that is learning. And in order to love God more, we have to know about Him more. We have to know about His world and what He has created us and everything else do that. And so it's not brainwashing by any means. It's telling people truth. And so if someone considers that brainwashing, then they have some inconsistencies in their worldview that I would like to challenge.
Yeah, sure.
But ultimately, what we're doing is just highlighting how it is. For example, Pythagoras, we always give him as this genius back in the ancient times that he formulated this Pythagorean theorem. Well, he did not. God actually had that there. He just discovered a way to understand God a little bit more. And that is a big difference between the two different types of thought, is that in Christian worldview, we start with some presupposition that God created everything, and from that, all the rest of it is as to fulfill and be coherent.
Yeah, we're going to bring up a verse from Deuteronomy on the screen here that is written by Moses, of course, and talking about how the inculcating and the teaching, in this case we're talking about the Old Testament law, but the principle is binding across to the New Testament. Mm-hmm. That is to be a deliberate act by parents, that we're supposed to purposefully set out to teach them as we walk, stand up and lay down, as we walk, as we do this, we do that. Everything we do, we should teach our kids how to understand God's world and the way that He made it. Now we got about 10 seconds. If you could just sort of wrap that thought up a little bit for us.
Yeah, well, I'm called to be an educator, and the parents are called to be parents. And so they've asked me, just like they would ask a doctor to help them with their health, they've asked me to use my expertise, research, and training to help them do the best that they can as parents and make sure these children know what they need to know. Yeah,
they could come alongside the parents and assist them in doing what God has called them to do. Our first segment's over, so we'll be right back after a few moments. Thanks.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm joined today by Dr. Mark Stanton of Salem Christian School, and we're talking about training children and young people in the Christian worldview. Now, Mark, we were in our previous segment, we were just sort of laying the foundation a little bit. We briefly talked about the mandate from like Deuteronomy that teaches, that we as parents are to inculcate and teach our children about God, what God has done in history, particularly what He reveals in the Bible. Now, so we have twofold. You mentioned briefly outside of the Bible studying math and history. So, but let's bring these two together. Let's talk about how being excellent at educating children and having them strive for excellence, how that relates to the gospel and glorifying God. If you could talk about that, because I think that's really important.
Yeah. Well, excellence sometimes can be considered subjective, but in a Christian worldview, in my particular worldview, I don't find it subjective because excellence is found with the image of God. And so in that, in order for me to pursue that excellence, I have to know what that image actually looks like outside of this tainted sort of sinful thoughts that I may have at times as a human being. And so what I try to do and what my faculty and staff, because each of us are devoted to the ministry of Christian education, and partnering with those parents who want the same thing, is that when we're teaching a subject, we make sure that they see it in light of the truth that God has given. Because I would say that all truth is God's truth. And so whether somebody secular figured that truth out or whether I did or some other follower of Christ has done, it's still truth. And so if it stands up and it's consistent, coherent, and it coincides with biblical truth and how God's revealed himself throughout history, then it's true. And so in that, we are trying to make sure that we are consistently and always trying to improve and move towards that image of what God has do. So loving him with all our minds, bodies, souls, and hearts, as well as loving our neighbors ourselves. So no matter what we do, it has to fit in one of those two commandments.
Yeah, that's really excellent. I see one of the things that we talk about for our archaeology dig. Our director of excavation, Scott Stripling, he says we're striving for excellence, not perfection.
Oh yes,
it's an interesting thing, and so I've had to learn that too, even as an adult, that we have to teach children that we want to teach them to excel to the glory of God, but they're not going to be perfect, and that takes the pressure off them, doesn't it?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's really about the pursuit in our Christian life, in our intellectual life, our spiritual life, because I don't really see any difference between any of those, because everything is spiritual to me.
Yeah. This also speaks to what we're talking about with education. We had a previous episode, we called it Facts versus Faith, where the prevailing idea is to separate God from history, science, and all that kind of thing. And we're talking about something here that's radically different than that.
Yeah.
For example, you in the previous segment mentioned about Pythagoras and about mathematics. Actually, what we would teach children and believe ourselves is that there's a philosophy of mathematics behind the discovery of that. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, not only math, but science and history. Just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, in the world of Christian education, it's biblical integration is really how we just summarize all of that.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is figure out how we put the Christian worldview into something, and or really actually draw it out because it's already there. And so when you're looking at math or any sort of subject, there's like two ways to approach it. One is that it explicitly shows and reveals God as who he is. And the other one is the purpose of it can be used for godly purposes. And so if you're talking about mathematics or addition, and when you're talking to a first grader, or you're talking about algebraic equations or engineering proposals in high school, you're really talking about both of those things. So like addition, you want to know how God has actually created the world. Like Fibonacci figured out this pattern that you can also see in nature. During the Renaissance, they were brilliant at figuring all of this out. And we've sort of forgotten that in our humanistic way along the way. And so it's really just seeing and helping our students see how this all points to the truth and how God's revealed them. The rocks will cry out. Literally.
Yeah, that's right, and we like that here at ABR.
Of course.
You know, with archaeology and the Bible, but they do, you know, and we're talking about, like, from a theological perspective, we're talking about special revelation, that is, the revelation of Scripture. God speaks and has preserved that in the text of the Bible, and then what we call natural revelation, the world itself, and as we explore it, what is it you said? You said, we draw out of it what's already there, right? And the Scriptures tell us that the world will reveal God to us. It's a fascinating thing. And we want kids to connect those two, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are extremely different points of view and perspectives in a Christian environment than you would find in a public secular environment.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I was thinking about the math thing, all the complex mathematics of like Newton and those sort of classic mathematicians who discovered all the way the universe has this mathematics embedded in it. The naturalist has a major problem explaining that.
Yeah.
Not that we want to delve into mathematics here, but it's just the whole point of it is we see God in everything that we study.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's that second fold part is like if I'm learning engineering and I want to love God with all my body and soul because I want to love others and as a reflection of that, then I'm going to want to make the best bridges. If I'm a neuroscientist, I want to make sure that I give the glory to God and that I can help people be healthy so they can minister. So whatever we do, it fits in one of those purposes. And like Jesus said himself, the greatest commandment is to love God with all your mind, body, and soul.
Yeah, and helping, we got about 30 seconds, helping children discover that. Because I can tell you from my own experience, I didn't know any of that growing up as a kid. And you have this privilege, because I didn't know Jesus until I was 28, you have this great privilege to help kids discover God through their whole life. It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's a great privilege.
That is true.
To do that. Now, what we're going to do in our next segment is we're going to talk a little bit about some Christian apologetics and some of the work that you do with the high school students. I think people are going to be excited to hear about that, and we'll be doing that momentarily. Folks, we'll be right back in a few moments. Don't go away.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures for students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm joined today by Dr. Mark Stanton of Salem Christian School in Macungie, Pennsylvania. And he is the head of school there, and we are talking about training children in the Christian worldview and how important it is. And we have a great passion at ABR for helping assist parents and educators to do exactly that, to teach them that they can trust the Bible and that God has revealed himself not only in the world, but also in the Scriptures. Now, Mark, we were finishing up in our last segment sort of talking about math and the excitement of children discovering, or in any subject, that God is in everything. But let's turn a little bit to Christian apologetics. You not only are the head of school, but you teach a high school class.
I do.
For apologetics. Now, you have young children in your school, and you have an array from preschool all the way to high school. Now, by the time they're in high school, a lot of their worldview is formed, but the die is not fully cast, and you have an opportunity to teach them apologetics. Let's talk about what you do in your class and why it's important.
Sure. I would hope that we're teaching some sort of apologetics or why we believe what we believe all the way through.
All the way through, right.
Absolutely.
Right,
However, it's highlighted primarily in 11th and 12th grade as specifically apologetics in 11th grade. Like, what are the fundamentals of the Christian faith? Why do we believe what we believe? The canonization of Scripture, all of those kind of things that are encompassed in that. And so, out of that, and then in their senior year, I get the great privilege of challenging them intellectually into the worldview. And so I've followed sort of Dr. Funk's model, who looks at like 7 different lenses, and they all interplay, they're all independent, for example, and they answer those big questions in life, like what was the origin? What is the nature of man? What is the nature of God? And of course, they have some fancy labels to them, like, and then axiology for like what's right and what's wrong. And so I get to challenge those students to take that bits of knowledge that they've learned in their apologetics and throughout their years at our school, particularly at Salem Christian School, and then I help them formulate a framework in which they believe. And so they have to figure out the centrality of those different things, how central it is, how strong they believe in that, how it affects other things. Because most of the time, well, I would say almost nobody actually goes through life and actually thinks about it in those terms, but we all act on that. And so what we believe is what we act. And so it's really trying to help those students answer those big questions in that framework so that they understand how the world works. And then if they have some inerrant thought in there, I'd love to challenge them and see, why do you believe that? I was like, that's not consistent over here, or it's not coherent with everything else you've said.
Yeah, what you're talking about, I guess I've read this as a sort of a worldview web. Everything is interconnected.
Yes.
In the Christian and then in the non-Christian worldview, what you want is coherence and consistency in them. And what I hear you saying is when someone's expressing something that's inconsistent, you want to intellectually challenge them to think through. Is that right? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if we say we believe in God, God has to have a nature in that belief. And if he is omniscient and omnipotent, then he knew or created, right? If we believe that the earth was created in evolution just by happenstance, and that we also say that we believe in a God, we can't have both. And so that's inconsistent and it's not coherent. And so that would be the challenge there. And so they would have to figure out what they actually believe. And so one of those might be stronger than the other, so they disregard it when later on. And that's what happens why so many people walk away from the faith, because they don't have a strong understanding in their worldview.
Yeah, that's really excellent. I think too, in that is the passion that you have, I bet would come across to your students, that you actually believe this.
Yes.
And that makes them, at the very least, take seriously the claims of the gospel. And of course, if they're a senior in high school, they've already developed quite a bit of thinking already. So now let's turn to part of this training in apologetics. A lot of people think, oh yeah, you put your kids in Christian school and then you don't talk to them about anything else out in the world, right? Now that's obviously not the case here. Right. So tell us a little bit about what you do with non-Christian or opposing worldviews in your apologetics class, because that's really important.
Oh yeah, I would say we spend quite a bit of time on that, because like I said earlier, all truth is God's truth. So I should not be afraid as a believer to confront anything. A lie will always show against the truth. And so obviously I talked about those 7 lenses, and they get generalized into certain type of worldviews like Christian, Muslim, secular, agnostic, whatever it would be, however we want to generalize or label them. And so we look at those and we say, well, how are they inconsistent? How are they incoherent? Why do they believe that way? So if they believe that this is, or they don't believe in a God, for example, or they question the existence of God, or he's irrelevant, then when we're looking at mankind or what's right and wrong and morality and those kind of things, they have some serious questions to answer. And so when these students go on, because the vast majority of students go on to some secular school.
College,
Yeah, absolutely. And in that, they're going to be challenged. Those are hotbeds for liberal progressive secularism, and they're going to be challenging the thoughts, and so many of them fall prey to it. And so I want them to be able to understand that those folks have a faulty worldview to begin with, because their presuppositions about life and where everything comes from and the answer to these big questions are wrong.
Yeah, that's really excellent. It's apologetics is twofold. What you're talking about. One is defense of the faith, and the other is then going on the offensive, not in an offensive way, but in a way that critiques the other worldview, get inside of it, and show how it doesn't work. And I think teaching kids this is just something that's so vitally important in the age that we live in. Now, we've got about 30 seconds to wrap up. If you could just share just a little bit more about the importance of apologetics in your training for the kids.
I mean, the great Christian tradition of like the book of God and the Doc, As images of God, we are in the dock. We are in the witness stand. So what do we know, and how are we going to give witness to that? And so are we going to give the truth, or are we going to give lies? And so I want to make sure my students, when they're standing before whomever or whatever, whether it be God himself or their neighbor, that they're able to understand the truth and articulate it.
That is excellent. Thank you so much for coming in today. It's a privilege to have you here. We're so grateful for people like you who are so committed to teaching kids the gospel. We're grateful for you, Dr. Stanton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Friends, we want to encourage you to pray for Salem Christian School. If your family lives in the Allentown, Pennsylvania area, consider enrolling them there and pray for that educational institution. They do excellent work. We thank you for watching the program today. Continue to pray for our young people in the world that we live in. We have serious challenges in the culture these days. Thank you.